Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 201, although it may seem like it's episode 211 and a half because it's sort of sandwiched between 211 and 212, because I guess we had a reschedule. Um, but the topic today is AI agents need intent, not roles, introducing IBAC. And our guest today, as most of you can see, is Yash Prakash, co-founder and chief strategy officer of Reva.ai. Welcome, Yash.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be
So
here.
before we dive into the actual content, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and background.
Absolutely, Mike. First of all, thank you for having me on this episode. Really looking forward to this conversation. I've been a big follower of the identity officers. As far as I'm concerned, I have been an identity and security practitioner for about 25 years. Started off my career in the consulting side of the business, where I was helping out a number of different large enterprises implementing their identity and security programs. In the second phase, I moved on to product side, where I led the product at Savient. I then became the chief operating officer, and when I moved out of the company, I was playing the role of the chief strategy officer. In the last year, I have started this new journey with Reva as co-founder and chief strategy officer. Working on this space.
Awesome. And so, and we met and we were chatting about this topic, I guess. You came out of stealth mode this year, and we were chatting at Identiverse, and I thought this would make for an interesting topic. And intent is very much in the sort of ether of discussion today with regard to agentic agents. Just to maybe point out one, for example, it makes me think in AAuth, Dick Hart's proposed agentic authorization protocol, he expresses, I think it's called the mandate in natural language, which is sort of like the intent. Eve Mailer talks about intent a lot. And so I think this is one of the hard things we're trying to pick apart in the industry. And one of the reasons is probably because of prompt injection and the dangers of prompt injection. And I felt like you sort of have a different take on prompt injection. Why do you think prompt injection is maybe irrelevant instead of trying to detect it?
Well, when I look at the trajectory of how agents are being brought to life, how enterprises are adopting, so they have moved from providing assistants which are more of generating text to now autonomous agents where they are actually taking actions on their own, autonomous workflows which are completely driven by agents, right? So in this context, the intent with which these agents are operating, the actions that these agents are taking, become extremely important from a actions that these agents are taking. The intent detection or identifying what intent these agents are acting becomes critical, because as the reason as they come up with, okay, these are the actions that I'm going to take. Now, when it comes to prompt injection, obviously there are many other risks associated with autonomous agents, prompt injection being one of them. What we have seen in our labs and as we are building out the intent and behavior based access control, prompt injection is one of the easiest ways in which you can make the agent go rogue or perform actions that are outside of the original intent. So that's one of the reasons why we think that identifying this prompt injection or any form of attacks can be prevented, right? So essentially, you have to look at the prevention angle rather than the detection angle, right? So you have to put preventive controls and intent and behavior based axis will help you identify the actions that are risky in nature. So ultimately, it comes down to, okay, do you have a resource that are resources that you are protecting, that are confidential, that are holding company sensitive information, and the actions that are allowed to be performed by an agent or agent acting on behalf of a human. So, are these actions valid and aligned to the intent, right? So, ultimately, you have to identify these, ensure that they are aligned at every step of the way.
So prompt injection isn't irrelevant. It sounds what you're saying is that that perhaps we should prioritize preventing prompt injection rather than detecting it. And it's always better to prevent than to detect, right?
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, so let's pivot a little bit. You know, natural language is very user friendly, but
Mhm.
also it can be very ambiguous. There's a whole branch of English literature called deconstruction, where when you say dog and I see dog, you think of one dog and I think of my dog, and are we really communicating with the same words? So there's this whole basically axiomatically natural language is ambiguous. And that's why I guess we have so many lawyers. And so, how do you actually take that natural language and then make it into something more formal? And is that always going to be the weakest link? Is that translation from the natural language into something that's more formal that we can then process?
Yeah, the I think the whole interaction between humans and agents are going to be, this natural language based, informal, and it's, if we were to do everything in a more deterministic way, then obviously the agentic world would not, function or would not exist. So the idea is the humans are interacting with however they want to, with whatever natural language comes to them. So certainly there is going to be ambiguity. Now, being able to decompose this intent, or the intent with which user is initiating a particular interaction, and then essentially mapping it to the resources that are available for its disposal, the skills essentially that have been created, the agent has been created with. A number of these parameters certainly go in terms of mapping the intent to the actions that are supposed to be allowed or denied, right? So, to your again, just to answer your question on, the ambiguity or the difficulty in deconstructing, certainly is there, and this is where we have to bring in AI to support AI, right? So, in the sense that we are using LLM as judge, as an approach to identify this intent, or identify the natural language, or translate this natural language into decomposed set of tuples, essentially being able to map it back to the skills that the agent is registered with, the metadata that, or the description with which agent has been created, the historical, information that we have in terms of what agent has performed over a period of time. So all of this sort of works in conjunction to be then able to identify whether the action the agent is going to perform, is it aligned, or can it be mapped back to the original natural language command or action that the user initiated with.
Hmm. Um, and that does sound hard to me, by the way. I think it's a very interesting approach that Reva has taken, that's described in the white paper, of mapping, of trying to parse this natural language and output into open FGA tuples. I think that's very interesting, and I definitely appreciated some of the numbers of like trying to quantify its effectiveness. I think is important because perfection isn't needed. You know, we want to get as far as we can. We're still going to have humans who need to jump in. Anyway, it's a very interesting approach. Maybe I could pivot for 1 second into something more fundamental. A lot of AI security companies are telling us that we need to inventory the identities, the software identities. Um, and then we can figure out their privileges and do access certification. And you worked at Savient, so you are very familiar with this approach. And it works for humans, and it works for humans doing workforce stuff. Um, but agents, there's a lot more software than there are humans. Also, the joiner, mover, lever is less, let's say, well defined in the software world. We have different types of software that gets identities in different ways. So, cloud identity uses SPIFFE. Maybe API in the API economy, we have OAuth, client registration. There's different ways software gets identities and proves its identities, asserts its identity. Do you think the approach that we can, when I say I'm skeptical about this approach, the pushback I get is we have 25 years of experience doing human identity like this, and it works. Therefore, we're going to take this approach and we're going to move it towards software. And we're going to inventory the software and figure out, review what privileges the software has and make sure that they have the least amount of privileges. Do you think this approach is going to work in the agentic in an agentic architecture world?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. I believe that the approach that we had taken in the past around IGA, or even for that matter, privileged access management, will not be relevant for in the machine or AI scale, right? Because we are going to be creating a lot more ephemeral agents which can spawn sub agents or can invoke other agents on the fly, right? So cloud itself brought complexity, right? So again, if we go a few years back, when cloud services brought on board or came on board, enterprises started using the cloud services. Right then, we had a challenge of how these services are going to be accessed. The traditional approach to vaulting the credentials or connecting to a database or a Unix or Windows servers, those were already extinct in a way. Certainly with cloud, which brought new ways or new approaches to addressing cloud privileged access as well. So now that is also getting surpassed, if you will, and agents bring a new dimension of challenges and the new set of requirements and scale that we have not seen even with the cloud era, right? So that scale problem is certainly there. Coming to the governance of it, the idea of performing certification on these agents, assigning definite permissions for these agents, again, breaks the whole notion of zero standing privileges. You do not want to be, first of all, creating agents, and you don't know what these agents are, because these agents can be spun up or can be created on the fly, right? So thinking that I'm going to assign certain permissions, even if it is just in time provisioning, the whole idea of provisioning itself, I would say, will become redundant in the agentic. We have to move towards more runtime rather than defining these permissions, defining these roles, and assigning these permissions at the inception of an agent. So the way we would approach is, or the industry should approach is, the agents should have the credential, whether you go with a spiffy based approach, you go with the idps providing agent identity. So that's essentially credentialing or assigning the identity. But then the access, as you move towards the access has to be correlated with either the action that the agent is allowed to perform, again mapping back to the skills and metadata and the whole objective with which you created an agent, or it has to be mapped back to the user who is allowed to invoke that agent and delegating the permissions, specific set of permissions to perform the action that that agent is trying to initiate, right? So the move towards zero standing privileges is the way to go. You don't assign permissions, you rather authorize an agent to perform a particular action with very specific scope permissions, or scoped authorization, if you will. So that's a shift, I would say. One last thing before I give it back to you, the certification. Again, we have been doing human certification. We have thousands of users where certification fatigue is already there. You cannot certify the human users, but now we are talking about probably hundreds and thousands of agents that are going to be running in the environment. And imagine who is going to certify that. Who's going to certify the actions the agents have performed? So it's going to become extremely difficult, which is where, the way Reva is approaching is that we have to certify policies and not certify the agents themselves.
Yeah, we were just talking about Ashay Rout. It was episode 174. Ashay Rout from Amazon was talking about the network of interconnected microservices, and you can think it just gets worse when you add agents into how many there are, and how difficult it would be for humans to actually perform this certification, and how we need more automation. In order to address this challenge. So it sounds to me, yeah, like you're saying, identity-based approach is not going to work, um, which leaves us with capabilities as the core unit of governance. And you mentioned actions. And in MCP world, I think actions and skills is more natural than identities themselves. Um, and but in with the lack of security, it seems like security has become human in the loop. Like we don't know how to solve security, so we'll just always ask the human what to do, and then we'll be covered. Even though the human probably gets consent fatigue after like 3 OKs, and stops reading, or stops reading carefully. But I feel like a lot of tools, they overemphasize human in the loop as a solution, when human in the loop is actually the problem. Like the humans are the weakest link for security. Um, and what we would really like to do is prompt the user only when it's important. And so how can more automation really help us get to this goal, do you think?
Yeah, I think uh, the only solution to this and to scale across different agentic surfaces that we see enterprise adopt is to go with policy as code, right? So essentially, everything can be declared. Policies can be created for different scenarios, whether it is the capabilities, which is a combination of the action and resources that we discussed about, or who can really invoke these capabilities. So ultimately, it comes down to whether you have a control plane where these actions or where these policies can be created. Using different existing paradigms that we have, that we are familiar with, right? For example, you can bring in RBAC. So while role based access control is more more suitable for a human interaction, but still you can bring role based policies, which can be sort of used using the delegated model, or you can use ABAC. You can use RBAC, but we also have brought in IBAC, which is the intent-based policies, essentially mapping it back to the capabilities and specifying. For example, if you are invoking this agent to perform this particular action, and if
Yeah.
this intent is what you want to perform with that agent or the action with that agent, then you can define or describe these as policies, right? So ultimately, the way you can scale this is to have a control plane where you can define different types of policies that control how decisions can be made, right? The enforcement of these decisions can happen natively in the agents, can happen through an a gateway. It could be API gateway or an agent gateway, or some sort of a layer which is doing all the enforcement. But ultimately you need to have a central place where you can define these different types of policies. Policy would become, I would say, the most important primitive that would reduce the burden of HITL and essentially focus on the resources that you're protecting, right? For example, if you're looking at a high sensitive resource where the risks are certainly higher, right? The thresholds that you need to evaluate as part of the policies are much lower compared to a low risk resource. So ultimately, you can define these as policies and tying it back to the metadata, the context, the runtime, all of those, information would become inputs to your decision making, and more importantly, to how you are defining these policies. Now, if you reach a point where you see that the risks are high, or the agent is basically tripping on number of guardrails. Again, guardrails is something that we have not spoken about. I would say guardrails is other side of the policy coin, in how we look at it. So being able to define security or compliance guardrails, and then based on your risk thresholds, bring in human in the loop. So to your point, certainly HITL, and bringing the consent asks for every action that the agent is performing is going to be unsustainable. It has to be bound by policies, and only for those decisions where you would want a human to be involved. For example, in case of, let's say, insurance agent, which is autonomously evaluating the application that it has received, you can specify a policy. So, for example, if you want to say that for an application which is 100,000 or below, let the agent, do all the analysis, let it approve. But if it is crossing that, and the risk signal that we are evaluating points to the fact that it needs to be approved by an underwriter, so bring the HITL. So you need to play with how you are going to bring HITL and reduce the fatigue or complexity of adopting agents.
Yeah. I was sort of laughing at your example because I thought of another example. I had a colleague who actually, we were at a client. This is before I started Glue, it was consulting days. And he did RM minus RF slash user. He deleted the user folder. On a Unix system, I have to say, this is a bad thing to do. I don't recommend it.
Yeah.
And I think in that point, it might have been okay to prompt the human, are you sure you really want to RM minus RF slash user? Because I don't, even though you're allowed to do it, I don't know if that's a good idea. So I'm not anti-human in the loop. I think actually like helping the human out a little bit sometimes and getting them to think about stuff can be really good. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so permissions isn't a panacea because he had permission to do it. Um,
Exactly, and that is where we have to use policy as a fulcrum, as a foundation to define what is allowed, what is the action, and why is this agent trying to perform this action, right? So this is where both the intent evaluation, what we call as the intent drift, detection, as well as the behavioral anomaly, right? For example, if you are asking a coding agent like a Cursor or a Claude Code to perform, deletion of a ticket or a file, and while I would still say that we have had very difficult experience in breaking some of these coding tools to drift. It does drift based on how you mentioned about natural language, how you give a command, it can translate and go adrift. So the idea is to identify those actions and then bring human in the loop, right? So yes, it has to be calibrated.
um, so, um, okay, so let me just take you at your word and say um, that intent-based access control is a thing, um, and that I want to do a better job at this. I want to implement this at my enterprise. And so I would need uh, your. I just told Yash in the back chat that his T-shirt is backwards. Oh, I didn't notice. So yeah, if you go into the little gear bar, I think under video, there's a mirror video settings. I'll let you do that in case we need to use this as there you go. That's way better. I have to remember pool on the right. Um, okay, yeah. So just to pedal back a little, um, we were saying, okay, let's assume IBAC is a thing, and companies say, okay, I do want to use intent-based access control. Um, what are the metrics that you can use to understand if you're doing a good job at that and how it's going? How do we know, or how are we going to measure IBAC as an effective system? Any thoughts about that? Is it too early to start thinking about metrics, or are you looking at any particular metrics that might be helpful?
Yeah, so what we have been able to do, Mike, is to come up with different vectors that we are using to evaluate whether there is an intent drift or not, right? So we are essentially looking at whether, as part of the intent chaining, we see if there has been any decay. Now, the decay of intent can happen in multiple ways. So, for example, I am working on an identity, or I'm working or looking at a particular resource. Suddenly, I start changing the resource. Again, taking an underwriter example, I've been working on a particular loan applicant. Suddenly, I have drifted and started looking at a different loan applicant without any specific reasoning. The agent has started drifting, right? So that's just one of the vectors. But we are also looking at different vectors, including whether the actions changed, whether the action that it is trying to perform, is it aligned to the behavior. For example, again, the underwriting example, in order to approve a particular loan, the agent typically takes steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it either has skipped steps, or it is jumping after one step. It has taken a different identity to sort of process the loan. So again, we are basically looking at about 6 different dimensions or vectors, and within that, we are essentially looking at multiple sub dimensions, if you will, right? So being able to then come up with a drift score.
Hmm.
So, and again, this is something that we have recently patented. We have filed for that. So again, a lot of work that has gone in to essentially combine the behavior, the intent, and essentially identify whether there has been any drift of both intent and behavior. So once the system flags that it is a risky, and again, we have the ability to define that those thresholds. For example, for a critical resource or a critical application, the thresholds could be much lower, in the sense that if I say that the drift score is 50, then we can bring in human in the loop, to your previous question, right? So depending on the sensitivity of the resource, depending on the risk that we are able to identify, you can move the needle in terms of denying that particular request, bringing human in the loop, or continue to monitor if this decay deteriorates, right? So every hop we are calculating the drift, and every time we are calculating if the decay is strong enough that we bring in any action, right? So we call it as a defer or escalate option. So it's not allow or deny, but an escalation, right, or a defer, where we can bring human in the loop, or other channels, if you will, to address this.
Interesting. So it sounds like, just in my head at least, what you're saying is the human uses natural language, um, and you map that into tuples, into open FGA tuples, which appealed to you for some reason, just to be a good match for this task. Um, And then on the other side, you have central policies, which are approved by the enterprise, and the CISO and the business units. They say, here are other policies, and these policies probably map to controls and compliance. And it sounds like you're saying that these are two separate processes where we then in the middle, the tools have to sort of live by the policies of the enterprise, and we're trying to figure out if based on those policies and this mapping of like actions and resources we got from the intent, if they match. But do I have it kind of right at a high level? Is that the architecture you think we're looking at?
Yes, one thing that I want to call out is we are using a tuple-based architecture, but it's not necessarily OpenFGA based. So, I mean, we do support OpenFGA as a framework because we also support Cedar, we also support OPA, but essentially we are using graph technology, if you will, for mapping out all these tuples and essentially map out all the intent to actions and capabilities that we spoke about earlier. But I think what you explained in terms of how things are generally mapped out is accurate. What we are doing in addition to the policies that you described is the whole detection, the guardrails, right? So where we are able to identify the different types of risks. We've started off with prompt injection, so we have guardrails to detect prompt injection. So this is not essentially at a model level, right? So if you again go back in time to see how enterprises are maturing, how vendors are also offering capabilities, the prompt injection and other guardrails were primarily at the model in front of the models, right? What we are doing is for every decision that is happening within the decisioning engine is also not only evaluating the deterministic policies, but is also evaluating all the different risks. It could be from prompt injection, jailbreak, hallucination, and all the AI security risks you can imagine gets evaluated, right? Along with intent and behavioral drift detection as well. So architecturally, you are right, but as we are evaluating, the IBAC, bringing in the AI security guardrails, also evaluating the deterministic policies all at the same time before we can say this action is allowed or denied or escalate, right? We certainly use the transaction tokens, the 8693. We also bring in the transaction tokens, and essentially collaborating a bit with Ashai as well, in terms of how we have brought those capabilities into the product.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid going down the transactions tokens rabbit hole. And but I wanted to pick up on something else that you were talking about, because you mentioned risk a couple of times. If a transaction is risky, then we maybe do something else. But policies don't inherently allow you to capture any information about risk. I mean, you might see risk in the context of a transaction as like a risk score could potentially be input. If some external data pipeline maybe gave you a risk score, that could be factored into a policy. But in general, policies don't normally capture risk. So what are your thoughts about how do you actually understand which are the risky transactions and or which are the risky capabilities?
Yeah, great question, Mike. Again, when it comes to a resource, right? Agents are acting on a resource. Let's take a couple of examples. Let's take an example of an application where you have a transaction. Let's say approve an invoice, right? Now, an invoice itself as a resource that we are protecting, and approve being an action, right? So resource itself can have metadata or information that we can gather, whether by looking at the information within that resource or attributes of that resource. For example, if that resource or if that invoice is for $1 million, you might think that is a significantly higher number that you can put in the policy, as I mentioned earlier, that okay, an agent cannot approve an invoice which is greater than $1 million because it is risky. So again, risk can come from different dimensions or different sources. This being the metadata is one of them. The second example that I would take is, let's say you have data, right? So the data is everywhere. And obviously, enterprises might have assigned risk score based on the sensitivity of the data itself, right? A financial, information could be risky or confidential, based on which, again, using, either bringing in that from a DSPM or data security or the DLP sort of solutions, where you can understand that this data, this file is sensitive, and essentially the policies are being created to not be very particular about a resource, but the policy is generic to say that, hey, if I am trying to send email in a way, the risk is the exfiltration, right? The data is sensitive, the document is sensitive, the action that I'm performing is export or send that in an email. The risk that you are essentially triggering is that of an exfiltration, right? So, as a security and compliance team, you can specify a policy, which could be a global policy that applies to any agent or any application, which essentially says that if an agent or a human for that matter is trying to export a document that tagged as sensitive or tagged as confidential, I am going to raise the exfiltration risk, and I'm going to block that, right? Again, we are essentially looking policies, again, from a policy control plane, bringing in risks and signals from various sources. And this is where you can define policies based on the shared signals framework or CAPE, essentially bringing in data to help build a policy that would consider risk as a core component of defining it, right? So I'll take a pause here, Mike, just to see if that answered the question that you were trying to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're coming up on the end, so maybe I want to circle back to a slightly higher level, and because you made an interesting point about what I would call left of LLM or right of LLM. So you said a lot of the tools are trying to stop the prompt injection left of LLM by analyzing the input and taking out the, generate recipe for pasta bolognese, that's in the rest of the prompt. And it sounds like you're trying to do the much harder job, which is right of center, taking the prompt and saying, okay, whatever the prompt said, I'm trying to map that, and I'm gonna deny all, and I'm gonna specifically allow within certain thresholds only these actions. Is that sort of an accurate way to think about it? And yeah, and how do you see the market for that? Do you see a lot of other companies trying to do this? Is this a unique approach? Where's the
It's
state of
a great question, Mike. Certainly, this is state of the arts. Definitely very interesting from where the market is currently and how it is or where it is heading. We see a lot of interest and demand for what we are doing. A lot of great, customers as well as opportunities where we are essentially trying to solve this. Customers, as I mentioned earlier, are moving out away from, or not moving away, graduating, if you will, from co-pilots to actual autonomous agents, and they feel that the authorization that they have, either with their IDP, coarse grain authorization, or perhaps the authorization that they might have built, either with a vendor or not, is not sufficient or not enough for AI security challenges that they are foreseeing, right? And that is where they see both intent and behavior-based access control to be a solution. Perhaps not a panacea that you also highlighted earlier, but it is certainly taking a defense in depth approach, this is going to be an important element. As far as the market is concerned, I think it is fairly early. I would think that we have made tremendous progress as a company in terms of investing in building this technology, investing in creating something really solid with good efficiency, right? So we have tested it with about 98% accuracy with our both LLM and a small language model approach for detecting the drift. So, but again, it is early stages. I would say, and applying it across different surfaces, because again, this is not we are not only talking about autonomous agents or pro code agents, but we are also talking about different types of agents that are coming up. Some might be built with Copilot sort of experience. Some might be coding agents. We discussed about Cloud Code or Codex. So different agentic surfaces, but having a same control plane, if you will, in applying these controls homogeneously or centrally is what we are looking at.
Interesting. Okay, well, pigeons are flying, or will be shortly. We just hit 41 minutes. And let me just before we announce and wrap up, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think great conversation so far. A lot of interest in this space. As a company, we have been doing and investing heavily in creating the IP from the intent and behavioral access control. I think this is the way forward for the industry, and yeah, I think it is a critical fourth pillar, if you will, for enterprises who are familiar with IGA or PAM or access management. Authorization is now coming of age, especially from a runtime security perspective in the agentic era.
And I'm sure we'll be hearing more and hopefully seeing you as a guest as you make more and more progress.
Absolutely.
So, quick note: if anyone wants just to read the white paper, we have a geeky GitHub wiki page for every episode. So it's glue.co/IOH- the episode number. This is episode 201. I'm excited to announce our next episode with Ayesha from WSO2, who's been doing a lot of great work on MCP. She's actually been really helping me out with her articles. So we have her on for a timely discussion because a new MCP draft just dropped. And so we're going to do a debrief on what's in there, especially the OAuth parts in there. And I'm sure you've all followed Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn or YouTube already. But if you haven't, please follow it. We're trying to get to 3,000. So it helps us out a lot. And with that, I will say, Yash, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a good conversation. I had more questions and even more that I thought of, but I'm going to spare you from the rest of them and let you get on with your evening. But thank you again for being on.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
And thanks, audience, for being here. And we'll see you next time.